Imagine waking up on a normal day. The market is running, schools are open, people are going about their lives. And yet, underneath that normal, something has already started to break. Not all at once, but quietly. Trust, resources, institutions, meaning. Almost no civilization collapses from a single blow. It collapses when the gears that once seemed permanent become too expensive to keep turning, when inequality becomes the rule, when power trades virtue for appearances, and when people stop believing that this is worth it. That's exactly where philosophy comes in. At the moment when history stops being a list of dates and becomes an uncomfortable question. What holds a civilization together, and what rots it from the inside? Plato feared a city ruled by desire and factions. Confucius said that without moral example, order turns into theatre. Ibn Khaldun observed that social cohesion weakens when luxury replaces purpose. In other words, civilizations don't fall only because they lack strength, but because they lose their foundation. And the most dangerous question isn't why did Rome fall, or why did the Maya disappear? It's this: what warning signs show up before collapse, and how many of them are we ignoring right now? Civilizations depend on a simple material foundation: water, fertile soil, wood, energy, a stable climate, and enough biodiversity to support food and health. When that foundation deteriorates faster than society can restore or replace it, the crisis stops being environmental and becomes political, economic, and moral. Jared Diamond, in Collapse, describes this pattern. Societies decline when they damage their environment at a pace faster than their ability to adapt. Collapse doesn't happen overnight. It shows up as a chain of small losses that build fragility. Farm output drops, the cost of getting resources rises, conflicts over access increase, and the state spends its energy putting out fires instead of planning. Easter Island is a striking example of this mechanism. Gradual deforestation removed the wood needed for canoes, transport, and basic economic life. Once the forest was gone, the ability to fish in open waters and move resources also fell. The result wasn't just fewer trees, but the breakdown of an entire survival system. Less food, less mobility, and more social instability. Diamond uses cases like this to show how decisions that seem reasonable in the short term can create a disastrous collective future in the long term, especially when the environment has a low capacity to recover. This pattern also appears in highly organized farming society. In Mesopotamia, irrigation supported growth, but in dry regions, it can cause soil salinization. Over time, the land loses productivity. The usual response is to push harder, irrigate more, expand acreage, demand more labor, and more control. That can keep production going for a while, but it also wears the system down faster. A civilization can still look strong on the outside while becoming vulnerable on the inside. That's the key point. Many collapses happen while society still believes it's in control. Thomas Malthus, in an essay on the principle of population, gives a basic mathematical structure for the problem. Population tends to grow faster than resource production, creating crises. Even with modern technology, the logic still matters when you think in terms of limits. If total demand rises and resources don't keep up, the system comes under strain. That strain may show up as hunger, but also as higher prices, inequality, fiscal stress, broken supply chains, and aggressive political competition. The point isn't to claim misery is inevitable, but to recognize there is a carrying limit. When that limit is crossed, any shock, drought, war, disease, a logistics disruption, becomes a multiplier of suffering. The modern version of Malthus's warning isn't only about headcount, but about consumption patterns and the economic model. Even in countries with low birth rates, demand for energy, water, industrial food, and raw materials can keep rising. Pressure increases when the system needs continuous growth just to stay stable. If the ecological base can't keep up, growth turns into accelerated extraction. Groundwater pumped faster than it refills, fishing faster than stocks can reproduce, soils used until nutrients are depleted, Forests cut without time to recover. The crisis hits when replenishment becomes slower than withdrawal. Laozi, in the Tao Te Ching, addresses this same issue in ethical and political language. Imbalance with the Tao, the way of nature, creates disharmony. Excess weakens what it tries to strengthen. The attempt to control everything and force results against the rhythm of the world produces side effects that slip out of control. Applied to societies, this shows up when a civilization treats the environment as something to dominate completely. Land becomes inventory, rivers become tools, forests become obstacles, climate becomes an external variable. That mindset boosts efficiency in the short term, but raises risk in the long term, because it ignores that natural systems aren't infinite or fully predictable. In practice, when ecological limits tighten, social effects stack up. Scarcer resources raise prices. Higher prices raise tension. Tension increases polarization and radicalization. Radicalization weakens cooperation. An ecological crisis becomes a crisis of trust. Groups begin accusing other groups of stealing the future. Under pressure, the state often leans toward two risky paths: repression to contain conflict, or economic improvisation to buy short-term stability. Either way, structural fragility grows. A society that loses material predictability also loses moral predictability. Right now, the warning signs are visible on multiple fronts: water stress in urban regions, more frequent and costly extreme weather, biodiversity loss, erosion and depletion of farmland, and rising disaster costs. This doesn't hit everyone equally. It hits first those with less protection: people in high-risk areas, people who depend on stable food prices, people in fragile jobs. Ecological inequality becomes social inequality. And as social inequality grows, it weakens the shared civic bargain that holds institutions together. Looking ahead, the most consistent scenario with history isn't one single global collapse, but regional collapses and cascading crises. Cities or regions losing viability due to extreme heat, long droughts, or repeated flooding. Supply chains breaking, migration rising, public costs growing, political conflict intensifying. What determines whether a country passes through this with stability or breakdown is the speed of adaptation compared to the speed of degradation. That comparison is exactly Diamond's core test. If degradation moves faster, society falls behind its own crisis. This lesson brings these three thinkers together around one central point. Civilizations fall when they treat limits as temporary obstacles instead of permanent features of reality. Diamond shows the historical pattern of collapse through environmental degradation. Malthus shows the pressure that builds when demand outruns the material base. Laozi shows how excess and forced control create imbalance and backlash, trapping a civilization inside its own urge to dominate. The question this topic forces is simple and hard. Which resources today feel cheap and guaranteed, but are actually the flaw of our stability? Water, fertile soil, energy, a predictable climate, and biodiversity aren't side details. They're the invisible infrastructure of any civilization. When that infrastructure weakens, collapse starts before most people notice. And when they finally do, it's almost always more expensive and more painful to fix. Civilizations don't collapse only because they run out of resources. Many fall into crisis because they get too good at creating solutions, and over time, those solutions become a weight they can't carry. Joseph Tainter, in The Collapse of Complex Societies, explains this mechanism clearly. Societies respond to problems by adding complexity: more layers of administration, more specialization, more infrastructure, more rules, more control. This works as long as the benefits of complexity outweigh the costs. Collapse draws closer when complexity starts producing diminishing returns. Every new layer costs more than it delivers, and the society ends up supporting a system that's too big for what it can produce. At first, increasing complexity is a win. An empire expands and needs roads, an army, taxes, courts. A city grows and needs sanitation, water supply, regulation, inspections. An economy diversifies and needs banks, contracts, standards, institutions. Each solved problem creates growth, order, and predictability. The danger shows up when the civilization learns to answer everything the same way. More systems, more control, more spending. At some point, all those responses add up into a kind of structural debt. It's not just financial debt, it's debt in energy, time, trust, and human capacity. Society starts working mainly to keep its own machinery running. Tainter stresses an important point. Complexity isn't bad by itself. It's a strategy. The problem is that strategies have costs. When a system becomes large and sophisticated, it depends on steady flows, stable revenue, skilled labor, functioning logistics, security, and a minimum level of social agreement. If any part of that circuit breaks, complexity turns into fragility. A simple system breaks and reorganizes. A hyper-complex system breaks and freezes, because everything depends on everything. The civilization then faces a dilemma. Either it adds even more control to try to stabilize things, or it accepts losing capacity and simplifies. In Tainter's view, collapse is often forced simplification. The system doesn't end, it shrinks, loses layers, cuts institutions, abandons territories, and returns to a level it can actually sustain. A classic historical example of rising costs under pressure is the Roman Empire in its later periods. Maintaining long borders required an expensive army, forts, roads, supply lines, salaries, and tax bureaucracy. The more the empire had to defend and manage, the more resources it pulled out of the productive economy. To compensate, it raised taxes, tightened controls, added rules, and tried to stop revenue loss. But that could reduce economic initiative and increase social resentment. The state machine grew, and people's willingness to support it weakened. This kind of fiscal and administrative strain is a concrete case of diminishing returns. The cost of maintaining order rises at the exact moment the ability to pay for order falls. Max Weber helps explain the psychological and social side of this process. In The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he analyzes the rationalization of modern life, the shift toward calculation, prediction, efficiency, and control. That rationalization creates productivity, discipline, and coordination. But Weber also warns about bureaucracy. It's efficient for routine tasks, yet it can lock society up when it becomes an end in itself. A bureaucracy that grows too much creates slowness, rigid formalism, fear of making mistakes, the shifting of responsibility, I followed the procedure, and a culture where the rule matters more than the purpose. When bureaucracy dominates, social vitality drops. Innovation becomes a risky exception. Capable people spend their energy navigating systems instead of solving problems. Life fills up with forms, barriers, and extra steps, and the society loses agility. Weber describes this as a kind of trap. Rationality, which should free us by organizing life, can become an iron cage that crushes the spirit. In civilization terms, this means administrative complexity can survive even after it stops serving the common good, because it protects itself, reproduces itself, and justifies itself. This connects directly to Tainter. When returns are falling, society needs fast adaptation, but bureaucracy often reacts with more bureaucracy. The system tries to save itself using the same medicine that made it sick. That creates a classic decline scenario. Huge amounts of energy are spent to maintain the appearance of normal life, while the real ability to solve problems keeps shrinking. The machine keeps turning, but delivers less. People feel it in everyday life. Services get worse, decisions take longer, the sense of unfairness grows, and trust in institutions wears down. Han-Feizi adds an even harder lens focused on state efficiency. In the Han-Feizi, political order depends on clear rules and consistent enforcement. Legitimacy isn't just moral, it's practical. When the state can't apply rules predictably, social behavior changes. People stop believing in fairness and start believing in cleverness. Favor networks, corruption, and factions expand because they feel more effective than the law. For Hanfezi, if the government loses the ability to execute, it loses real authority, even if it still has symbols and speeches. The link to complexity is direct. The more complex the rules, the harder they are to apply consistently. A state with too many laws, too many exceptions, and too many procedures can create the opposite of what it wanted. Instead of order, it produces selective chaos. People with power learn to use complexity to escape consequences. People without power carry the weight of the system. Law becomes a maze. And when punishments and rewards stop being predictable, society enters a kind of moral disorder. Right stops meaning just and starts meaning what works for me. That's corrosive because it destroys cooperation. A civilization without cooperation needs even more control to stay together, and that's when the spiral speeds up. This pattern shows up in many state crises. More and more positions, more taxes and fees, agencies created to supervise other agencies, everything dragged into courts, endless fights over who has authority. Each layer was created to solve a real problem, but together they become a heavy structure that drains social energy. What used to be organization becomes friction. That friction is invisible at first, but over time it reduces productivity, raises costs, and breeds resentment. People start seeing the state and institutions as obstacles, not as guarantees of shared life. In today's world, complexity isn't only in government, it's everywhere. Global supply chains, tightly connected financial markets, dependence on digital systems, critical infrastructure, international regulations, corporate bureaucracies, decision algorithms. This has brought huge gains, but also new vulnerabilities. A local failure can turn into a global crisis. A logistics disruption, an energy shock, a cyber attack, a banking confidence crisis. Any of these can spread fast because the system is interdependent. Here, complexity often means maximum efficiency with minimum buffer. A minimal buffer means small shocks become big. Looking forward, following the logic of these three thinkers, conflict between two forces is likely to intensify. On one side, ecological, health, and geopolitical crises will demand fast, coordinated responses. On the other, systems will become more complex, slower, and more expensive, with low tolerance for failure. If the default response is simply to add more layers of control, more rules, and more cost, the returns may keep falling. The social outcome is predictable. More disbelief, more informality, more radicalization, and more hunger for strong solutions that promise to cut the knot, and often cut rights, trust, and long-term stability along with it. Tainter gives a near-clinical warning sign. When a society has to spend more and more just to get the same level of order and well-being, it's entering the danger zone. Weber shows how this can crush the human energy that keeps a civilization alive. Hanfezi shows the breaking point. When the state machine loses the ability to enforce rules efficiently, order becomes a contest of force, and the law stops being a shared reference point. The decisive question is simple. Is complexity serving collective life, or is collective life serving complexity? If institutions and systems exist to solve problems, but become unable to solve the problems they create, the civilization falls into an internal contradiction. And internal contradictions, once they pile up, don't need an outside enemy to destroy a world. They can make it collapse from the inside. A society can have walls, armies, technology, trade, and even plenty of wealth, and still move toward collapse if most people feel the game is rigged. Inequality isn't just a number in a report, it's something you live every day. It's the feeling of working hard and going nowhere, while a small group piles up power, protection, and a future. When that feeling spreads, the social contract weakens. People stop obeying because they believe in the system and start obeying out of fear or because they don't see any other option. This is a recurring breaking point in history, the moment when we becomes them. Karl Marx in Capital treats this as a structural conflict, not a moral accident. The basic logic is that the system tends to concentrate wealth and power, because whoever controls the means of production controls the surplus. The worker sells labor. The capitalist buys that labor and keeps part of the value the worker produces. Over time, this dynamic can widen the distance between classes. For Marx, that creates contradictions that eat away at stability. Overproduction crises, unemployment, insecure work, fights over wages, and growing social resentment. The system doesn't need everyone to be starving to become dangerous. It's enough for the majority to realize prosperity exists, but it's not meant for them. That realization often grows during shocks. Inflation, financial crises, rising interest rates, unaffordable housing, the collapse of basic services. Inequality stops being abstract and becomes an open wound. Marx describes how capitalism can create spectacular wealth, but also produce constant insecurity for people who live off their own work. When people feel disposable, society becomes emotionally unstable. Politics turns into a stage for anger, and trust in institutions drops. What looked solid suddenly shows as a fragile foundation, the consent of the many. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in the Discourse on Inequality, takes a different path but lands in the same place. Inequality wrecks the legitimacy of the political community. Rousseau isn't only talking about natural differences between people. He focuses on moral and political inequality, created by institutions, property, and social comparison. For him, a decisive moment is when property becomes the foundation of the social order. Someone fenced off land and said, "This is mine," and others accepted it. From that point on, inequality stops being incidental and becomes organized. Rousseau anticipates a problem that's very easy to recognize today. When a society measures human value by possessions and status, it produces mass humiliation. And humiliation is explosive. It doesn't show up only as sadness. It shows up as anger, cynicism, and a desire for symbolic revenge. The political community, which should be a union of citizens, turns into an arena of comparison and contempt. When that happens, the law starts to look like a tool for the strong. Obedience stops being respect and becomes resignation. And resignation, when it builds up, turns into rupture. Marx talks about exploitation and class conflict. Rousseau talks about the corruption of social bonds and the loss of legitimacy. They meet at the same point. The state stops looking like a shared referee and starts looking like a manager of inequality. The deeper tragedy isn't only that some have a lot and others have little. It's that the system can't morally justify the gap. When the justification collapses, order enters crisis even before any revolution. Because political stability doesn't depend only on police and courts. It depends on a shared belief that the game is at least somewhat fair. Mencius, Mengzi, in the Confucian tradition, expresses this through the idea of the mandate of heaven. It's not a decorative metaphor, it's a theory of legitimacy. Rulers rule as long as they take care of the people. When they leave people in misery, especially when there is hunger, they lose the mandate. Hunger here is more than a lack of food. It's a sign of moral and administrative failure. For Mencius, the ruler has a concrete responsibility: guarantee basic conditions so people can live with dignity. If people are struggling to survive, that isn't just an economic issue. It's proof the government has lost the right to govern. This view is powerful because it ties morality to survival. In Mencius, legitimacy isn't held up by speeches, charisma, or tradition. It's held up by real human outcomes. A society can tolerate a lot for a while, but lasting misery destroys loyalty. And when loyalty disappears, two forces emerge: open revolt or silent disobedience. Collapse isn't always an explosion. Sometimes it's apathy, lower participation, rising illegality, brain drain, and the erosion of duty. The state still exists, but as a shell, not a living body. History gives clear examples of this pattern. The French Revolution wasn't only Enlightenment ideas, it was also pressure from inequality, high prices, and privileges seen as a direct insult. When people watch elites live as if they're outside the reach of rules and outside the shared suffering, anger becomes moral. The question stops being "I want more" and becomes "this is unjust." At that point, small events can become a spark. The system looks like it falls suddenly, but the rupture had been building quietly for a long time. Today, inequality shows up in new and often more irritating forms. It's not only income, it's access to healthcare, education, safety, free time, mobility, and emotional stability. It's the difference between living with a future and living on improvisation. In many cities, housing prices create an almost physical divide. Those who live near opportunity and those pushed far away. That distance becomes daily humiliation. Hours of commuting, exhaustion, less time with family, worse health. Inequality, then, isn't envy. It's life being worn down. On top of that, inequality in information and political influence keeps growing. People with resources pay for experts, lawyers, consultants, media, and lobbying. People without resources depend on weak services and promises. That creates the sense that democracy is formal, but real power is private. Rousseau would say the political community is corrupted when the common will is replaced by private interests. Marx would say this is economic power shaping the state. Mencius would say a government that allows misery and abandonment loses legitimacy, even if it keeps ceremonies and elections. If this dynamic isn't contained, the likely future is rising instability in cycles. Economic crises feed resentment. Resentment feeds polarization. Polarization blocks reform agreements. The lack of reform deepens the crisis. In that kind of environment, leaders appear promising fast order, often by offering internal enemies as the explanation: minorities, foreigners, traitors, parasites. That strategy works because it gives frustration an emotional target, but it often makes the structural problem worse because it redirects energy away from real reforms and into symbolic conflict. Society loses its ability to cooperate, and cooperation is the most important resource when material pressure rises. The breakdown of the social contract has fairly clear signs. First comes the belief that effort doesn't pay off. Then tolerance grows for workarounds and informality, because the rules feel unfair. After that, hostility rises between groups. Middle class against the poor against immigrants, workers against public employees, the outskirts against the center, countryside against cities. Public debate becomes a competition in resentment. Institutional trust collapses. Nobody believes the system will protect them, so everyone tries to protect themselves. That's when a civilization starts coming apart from the inside. Marx provides the lens of economic contradiction and class conflict. Rousseau provides the lens of moral legitimacy and the corruption of citizenship bonds. Mencius provides the practical ruler. If people are living in misery, the government has lost the mandate. It has lost the right. Together, they point to a truth that crosses eras. A society can endure a lot when it believes there's justice and a horizon ahead. But when inequality turns into destiny and humiliation, order becomes theatre. And theatre can't hold a civilization together when reality knocks on the door. The central question, in any era, is this: is the system producing belonging or expulsion? The social contract is an emotional agreement before it's a legal contract. It exists when people feel they share the same fate. When that feeling dies, collapse doesn't need invasion or a natural disaster. It can begin simply when millions decide, deep down, that they no longer owe anything to we. Power doesn't rot only because bad people rise to the top. It rots because the act of holding power creates the same temptations over and over: privilege, impunity, vanity, and fear of losing status. When those temptations become normal, corruption stops being an exception and becomes the system's default setting. Moral decay, then, isn't just an ethical problem. It's a collapse mechanism, because it destroys what holds any political order together: trust, predictability, and a shared sense of justice. Polybius, in Histories, describes politics as a cycle of degeneration, anacyclosis. A regime begins with a promise. Monarchy starts as necessary leadership, then decays into tyranny when the ruler treats authority like personal property. Aristocracy appears as rule by the best, then turns into oligarchy when the best start governing for themselves. Democracy rises as a response to oppression, then slips into mob rule when collective passion replaces law and good judgment. Polybius's point is that collapse doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from an internal shift that's almost predictable. The virtue that founded the regime turns into a vice once it becomes routine. This helps because it shows corruption is more than stealing. Corruption is when government's purpose changes. It's when public office starts serving private interests. Tyranny doesn't have to be pure violence. It can be institutional capture, nepotism, and rules bent to favor allies. Oligarchy doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up when policies are designed to protect a small rent-seeking minority, while the majority lives on promises. Mob rule appears when politics turns into a show of humiliation and revenge, and the law loses stability. In any stage, the result is the same. Citizens stop feeling there is a real common good at work. Augustine, in The City of God, deepens this on the spiritual and psychological level. For him, societies aren't held up only by institutions, but by what they love. When a community loves power, status, and worldly success more than justice, it organizes itself around vices, pride, greed, cruelty, and lies. Augustine challenges the idea that a strong empire is automatically a just one. Force can create outward order, but if the inside is driven by the desire to dominate, that order is fragile. It depends on coercion and fear is never a stable foundation for peace. A theme running through Augustine is that the desire to dominate, love in the wrong order, corrupts politics. The ruler starts loving their own image. The state starts loving expansion. Elites start loving luxury. And the public starts loving the promise of quick benefits. In that environment, truth becomes negotiable. Justice becomes marketing. Virtue becomes performance. And when morality turns into theatre, corruption becomes inevitable, because nobody believes in inner limits anymore. The only limit becomes, what can I get away with without being punished? Confucius, in the Analects, offers a practical theory of stability. Social order depends on the moral example set by leaders. Real authority isn't only punishment, it's ethical influence. When the ruler is upright, society tends to imitate. When the ruler is corrupt, corruption spreads as a standard. Confucius insists that rituals, education, and virtue aren't cultural decoration. They're social technology. Without them, the fabric of trust tears. And when trust breaks, the state has to increase coercion because people stop cooperating on their own. For Confucius, losing virtue isn't just personal sin, it's failure in public duty. A leader is supposed to be an anchor, a reference point. When the leader becomes an example of greed, dishonesty, or humiliating others, they destroy a shared sense of honor. The consequences are predictable. Cynicism grows, opportunism grows, and people become more willing to cheat. A person starts thinking, if they do it up there, why shouldn't I? That sentence is a moral thermometer of decline. You don't hear it in healthy societies. You hear it when legitimacy is melting. Put Polybius, Augustine, and Confucius together, and moral decay becomes a sequence. First, power drifts away from its purpose and becomes a prize. Then, the prize creates privileges. Privileges create impunity. Impunity creates arrogance. Arrogance creates contempt for the public and for the rules. And that contempt becomes public policy. Laws designed to protect allies, institutions used to punish enemies, public money treated like private property, and jobs handed out like trophies. At that point, corruption isn't a scandal, it's structure. History is full of moments when regimes fall once corruption becomes the normal language of government. At the end of the Roman Republic, for example, the system became less and less able to contain personal ambition and bought loyalty. Politics became militarized, the competition for power turned brutal, and trust in legality dissolved. It didn't fall because people lacked intelligence or culture. It fell because of moral and institutional breakdown. When rules become tools instead of limits, the republic loses its meaning. Polybius would see the degeneration of political forms. Augustine would see pride and disordered desire taking control. Confucius would see the failure of example and public honor. In everyday life, the moral decay of power shows up through small signs that grow into big ones. First come empty promises and fantasy narratives. Then useful lies become normal. Then selective enforcement appears. Enemies punished, allies forgiven. Then the double standard becomes the rule. The poor feel the weight of the law. The rich buy their way out. When that becomes the pattern, people stop believing in justice and start looking for protection in clans. Family, faction, party, religious group, gang, militia, corporation. Society turns into an archipelago, and an archipelago is fragile because there's no trust to face crises together. In today's world, moral decay gains new tools. Politics can become non-stop marketing. Reputation can be manufactured through networks, bots, edited clips, and constant scandals. Corruption can hide behind technical language, contracts, outsourcing, and complexity. At the same time, outrage can be manipulated. Citizens are fed anger to keep them engaged while real change never happens. That's dangerous because it creates a vicious cycle. People lose hope. Lost hope opens the door to cynical leaders, and cynical leaders speed up corruption. Polybius would say the cycle is moving forward. Augustine would say the earthly city is ruled by the wrong loves. Confucius would say virtue has become a mask. If this process intensifies, the likely future is politics built more and more on symbolic force or real force. When legitimacy falls, governments tend to compensate with propaganda and coercion. Propaganda tries to replace trust with narrative. Coercion tries to replace consent with fear. That can work for a while, but it's expensive. Resentment grows, internal sabotage grows, talent and capital flee, and people become more willing to accept extreme solutions. In the end, moral corruption produces paralysis. Crucial decisions don't get made because they threaten the interests of those benefiting from the system. Society gets trapped in a structure that drains energy and blocks reform until an internal or external shock pushes everything into rupture. A key point in all three thinkers is that moral decay is contagious. Not because humans are naturally evil, but because incentives and examples shape behavior. If the top rewards blind loyalty instead of competence, competence leaves. If the top rewards flattery instead of truth, truth disappears. If the top rewards fast enrichment instead of service, service becomes a joke. That kind of contamination destroys administrative capacity because nobody wants to be the lone honest person in a system that punishes honesty. The public machine becomes an organism that rejects antibodies. Polybius offers an implicit solution: balance and restraints, so a virtue doesn't turn into a vice. Augustine offers a deeper solution: reorder what society loves, put justice above pride, and remember that power without moral limits becomes idolatry. Confucius offers an educational and cultural solution: form virtuous leaders, restore duties and responsibilities, and rebuild trust through example. All three meet in the same demand: without inner limits, no external limits hold for long. So the moral decay of power isn't a sermon topic. It's survival engineering for civilization. A regime can endure poverty for a while. It can endure war for a while. It can endure disasters for a while. But it cannot endure for long the feeling that justice doesn't exist, that the law is theatre and the leadership is a separate class, untouched by the people's fate. When that settles in, society starts falling apart quietly, until one day the quiet becomes a scream. There comes a point when a government still has police, an army, a budget, courts, and propaganda, but it no longer has real authority. The machine is still standing, but the invisible foundation has collapsed. Trust. That's what legitimacy is. The shared belief that those in charge have the right to rule, and that the rules matter more than brute force. When that belief breaks, people obey only when they're being watched, only when it's convenient, or only out of fear. And a regime that relies on fear has to keep increasing fear. That becomes a spiral. Machiavelli, in The Prince, describes power as something that has to look solid and effective. It's not enough to be the ruler. You have to maintain the image of strength, judgment, and the ability to act, the famous virtu. Virtu isn't moral virtue in the religious sense. It's political skill, reading the moment, choosing alliances, cutting off threats, keeping order, and delivering results. When a ruler loses that image of strength and competence, power becomes vulnerable. And this isn't just about reputation, it's calculation. If people believe the ruler can't protect, punish, reward, or maintain stability, they start looking for alternatives. Machiavelli also stresses something many societies learn too late. Institutions hold power up more than charisma does. A leader can be brilliant, but if the state is weak, if the law is unstable, if succession is messy, if the army is disloyal, the regime collapses in the first real storm. In that sense, legitimacy isn't just liking the leader, it's trusting that the system works. When the system fails again and again, security, the economy, justice, public services, virtu starts to feel empty. And when virtu feels empty, loyalty turns into opportunism. That's where a common temptation appears. Replacing power with violence. Hannah Arendt, in On Violence, makes a distinction many regimes refuse to accept. For Arendt, power depends on collective support. It's the ability to act together, sustained by consent. Violence is different. It's a tool. Physical coercion, threat, force. Violence can impose silence, but it doesn't create agreement. It might solve an immediate crisis, but it comes with a price. It destroys whatever legitimacy is left. The more a government has to hit people to be obeyed, the more it proves it no longer rules through recognition. Arendt goes further. Violence can look like strength in the short term, but it's a sign of structural weakness in the long term. A confident regime doesn't need to turn every disagreement into an enemy. A legitimate regime can tolerate criticism, negotiate conflicts, and keep stability without humiliation or terror. When violence becomes routine, it breaks the basic foundation of social life. People stop trusting each other. They become afraid to speak. They avoid cooperation. They hide information, and that paralyzes society. The state loses its social intelligence. It governs in the dark. And in the dark, it makes bad decisions that deepen the crisis. Mosey, on the other hand, frames the problem in ethical and practical terms. In the Mosey, a government's legitimacy depends on delivering public benefit and practicing something close to impartial care, governing for everyone's good, not just for clans, nobles, factions, or favoured regions. When the state serves one group and abandons the rest, unity breaks. Revolts, fragmentation, and internal conflict begin. Mosey isn't romantic. He understands people obey when they see real common benefit and a minimum level of fairness. If government becomes a tool of favouritism, it loses the reason it exists. This impartial care doesn't mean treating everyone the exact same way. It means shaping policy to reduce avoidable suffering and prevent the public system from becoming private reward. Mosey criticizes waste and luxury because he sees them as a direct insult to the people. When elites show off wealth while basic needs go unmet, order starts to feel like a lie, and political lies are fuel for rupture. People stop trusting official words and start trusting rumors, alternative leaders, factions, and revenge. All three thinkers describe the same mechanism from different angles. Machiavelli. Power falls when it loses visible effectiveness and institutional strength. Arendt. Violence can replace power for a while, but it destroys legitimacy and speeds up collapse. Mosey: a government loses unity when it stops delivering public benefit and stops governing for everyone. Together, they describe a common sequence. Failures erode trust. Lower trust increases conflict. Conflict creates the temptation to use coercion. Coercion further destroys legitimacy, and society starts splitting into groups that no longer recognize each other. You can see this clearly in historical moments of revolt and regime collapse. When a state loses the ability to provide basic order and basic well-being, it starts depending on force. Force creates obedience on the surface, but surface obedience comes with quiet sabotage. Corruption grows, tax evasion rises, people dodge laws, do the bare minimum at work, and protect only their own. The economy loses energy. Administration loses quality. Politics becomes a cycle of crisis. Even if the regime wins confrontations, it loses the most important war: the war for everyday loyalty. Today, legitimacy is attacked by a dangerous mix: real institutional failures and the erosion of trust through misinformation and polarization. When people no longer know who to believe, media, science, courts, elections, the shared public space dissolves. Each group lives inside its own story. That weakens any collective action, because collective action depends on a shared reality. Arendt would warn that without that common ground, power falls apart and violence tends to rise, because debate turns into a war of competing realities. At the same time, the perception of injustice feeds the crisis. If citizens see impunity at the top and harshness at the bottom, they conclude the system isn't for them. Mosey would call that the abandonment of impartial care. Machiavelli would say the ruler is losing what matters most, being seen as necessary for security and order. The result is the rise of parallel authorities, local strongmen, militias, organized crime, informal protectors, client networks. When that happens, the state doesn't just lose legitimacy, it loses its monopoly on order. If economic, climate, and technological pressures keep increasing, the likely future becomes an open battle between two paths. One path tries to rebuild trust through institutional reform, transparency, predictable justice, and public policies that deliver real benefits. The other path tries to maintain order through control, surveillance, and repression. The second path can look faster, but it usually accelerates corrosion. Arendt would say, it trades power for violence, and that trade is destructive. Machiavelli would say, such a government might last, but it will always be threatened because it rules over resentment. Mosey would say, it breaks the people's moral unity, and without unity, the country fragments. A crisis of trust has clear signals. One is the collapse of credibility in official speech. The government speaks and nobody believes it. Another is the flight into conspiracy theories and tribal truths. Another is the shift of politics into non-stop accusations of bad faith. Nobody debates solutions, only motives. Another is the worship of force, when part of society starts wishing that someone would impose order without caring about legal limits. These signs show up when legitimacy is breaking, because people start preferring immediate security over slow institutions. But security bought with fear is unstable. Machiavelli has a line that captures how fragile power is without a base. The prince must avoid being hated and despised. Contempt grows when he looks weak. Hatred grows when he looks unjust and predatory. An illegitimate government often achieves both at once. It seems incapable of solving problems and, at the same time, perfectly capable of rewarding allies. That is the most explosive situation because it combines frustration with moral outrage. So what sustains legitimacy isn't perfection, it's predictability and a basic sense of justice. A regime can make mistakes and still be legitimate if it's honest, correctable, and treats citizens as part of the same shared fate. When that fails, power becomes a building without a foundation. From the outside, it looks firm, but inside, it's hollow. And when the next crisis arrives, economic, climate, health, geopolitical, What decides whether society holds up isn't just the size of the state. It's how much people trust each other and trust the system. Without trust, every shock becomes a crack. With enough cracks, the fall doesn't need to be pushed. It happens. An empire rarely falls because it loses one specific battle. It falls when war becomes routine, when the border turns into a constant bleed, and when expansion stops bringing gains and starts demanding non-stop sacrifice. Edward Gibbon, in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, describes imperial collapse as a mix of outside pressure and inside weakness. Attacks and migrations on the frontiers, rising military costs, political crises, administrative decay, and a loss of social cohesion. The point isn't that the enemies were too strong, but that the empire, internally, became less able to respond in a steady, consistent way. Imperial overreach happens when territory and obligations grow faster than the ability to sustain logistics, defense, and governance. At first, expansion seems smart. More taxes, more resources, more prestige, more security by pushing the border farther out. Over time, the frontier becomes too long, too diverse, and too expensive. Every new province demands garrisons, roads, supplies, administrators, and diplomatic commitments. The army stops being a tool of policy and becomes the state's basic condition for survival. When that happens, a crisis in one part of the map echoes everywhere else, because the empire is living on the edge. Gibbon notes that when pressure rises, empires often trade quality for quantity, rushed recruitment, higher taxes, debased currency, improvised alliances. These moves can hold the present together, but they weaken the future. Ordinary people feel like they're working to fund distant wars. Elites feel the political center growing unstable. Provinces feel the protection isn't worth the cost. The empire doesn't just lose material capacity, it loses loyalty. And when loyalty drops, an external war can quickly turn into internal conflict, because factions fight over command, resources, and who's to blame for the crisis. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, explains the anatomy of this kind of defeat without needing to name any empire. For him, defeat comes from bad strategy, poor adaptation, and not understanding yourself or your enemy. A state can have more soldiers and still lose if it misjudges its own limits. Morale, logistics, training, cohesion. It can have better technology and still lose if it sticks to an old plan on a new battlefield. It can have a just cause and still lose if war turns into pride, stubbornness, and a refusal to retreat when retreat is necessary. Sun Tzu's main lesson for empires is that war is a total cost, not a partial one. It's not just money and weapons, it's psychological wear, political wear, and social wear. He argues that the best victory is the one that avoids a long fight, because extended campaigns drain the state. The longer the conflict lasts, the more the government has to extract from its people. Taxes, conscription, restrictions, propaganda. And the more it extracts, the more it has to justify. And justifying sacrifice without results gets harder. Leaders then reach for honor, humiliation of the enemy, and absolute narratives. That can raise passion for a while, but it also shuts down negotiation and traps the regime in escalation. Thucydides, in the Peloponnesian War, explains why escalation is so common. Power and fear create spirals of conflict. The rise of one power threatens another, and that perceived threat produces preventive decisions that then increase hostility and confirm the other side's fear. This is devastating because war becomes rational inside the logic of fear. Nobody has to be crazy to fall into the trap. Each side just has to believe that if it doesn't act now, it will be vulnerable later. War begins as calculation, and once it begins, it changes a society's inner moral and political life. Thucydides also describes an intimate effect of prolonged war. It corrodes norms, language, and political character. In intense conflicts, cynicism grows, brutality grows, propaganda grows, punishment of dissent grows. Politics becomes more aggressive, and internal disagreement starts getting treated as betrayal. A society loses the ability to disagree without tearing itself apart. War stops being something out there. It enters the regime's bloodstream. And an empire that loses internal restraint becomes weaker precisely when it needs cohesion to resist outside pressure. Put Gibbon, Sun Tzu, and Thucydides together, and a clear pattern appears. External pressure becomes collapse when it meets internal fragility, and when leadership responds with rigidity instead of intelligence. Overreach makes the state depend on constant victories to justify rising costs. If victories slow or stop, the regime has to increase extraction and control. More control reduces trust. Less trust increases factionalism. Factionalism weakens strategy. Weak strategy produces costly defeats or expensive stalemates. And defeats feed even more fear, the Thucydidean engine that drives the spiral. Historically, the imperial frontier often becomes the laboratory for this logic. A long defensive line demands rapid responses to multiple threats. If the center reacts slowly, regions feel abandoned. If the center sends too many resources to one front, another front opens up. The empire turns into an organism with damaged circulation. Short-term fixes appear, outsourcing security to unreliable allies, hiring mercenaries, granting autonomy in exchange for peace. These solutions can work for a few years, but they create dependence and fragmentation. Central authority becomes smaller than it looks. Gibbon describes this kind of weakening as a process, not a single event. Sun Tzu would highlight a classic mistake of declining empires, fighting on ground chosen by the enemy with unclear goals. War without a clear goal becomes war just to save face. And war for saving face is exactly the kind that drains more than it delivers. It forces constant mobilization and denial of exhaustion. This is especially dangerous when society is already tired, the economy is already stressed, and politics is already polarized. The external enemy becomes a catalyst for internal collapse, because every domestic problem gets blamed on the conflict, and the conflict becomes an excuse for everything. Thucydides adds one more decisive layer. In rivalries, even the pursuit of security can destroy security. Each defensive military expansion can look like a threat and trigger a reaction. The spiral speeds up. And as it speeds up, the options narrow. Retreat looks like weakness. Negotiation looks like betrayal. Moderation looks naive. Society enters a psychological tunnel. That tunnel is a kind of strategic blindness. The state can no longer see paths other than escalation. In today's world, overreach doesn't require formally annexing territory. It can happen through scattered military commitments, distant bases, promises to protect many allies, economic disputes that turn into sanctions and counter-sanctions, tech and arms races, and proxy wars. Global interdependence expands the impact of any shock. Regional conflicts can disrupt energy, food, semiconductors, shipping routes, prices, and internal political stability. Modern empires, even if they don't call themselves empires, can bleed out from too many obligations and fear of losing prestige. If rivalries keep rising, the likely future is a world where direct and indirect wars exist alongside competition for technology, resources, and influence. That creates a constant risk management problem. States can get pushed into fast decisions by public pressure, misinformation, incidents, or the need to look strong. Machiavelli would talk about the value of appearances. Thucydides would warn that the appearance of strength can become a fear trap. Sun Tzu would insist that looking strong is not a replacement for strategy. The temptation will be to answer every threat with escalation, even when many threats demand intelligence, diplomacy, and internal reform. One common sign of overreach appears when the state starts sacrificing core domestic needs to sustain an exceptional external agenda. Basic services get worse, inequality grows, trust falls, and the government calls for unity only for war, not for the common good. A tired society splits between those who want to harden and those who want to pull back. That internal division is war's gift to the enemy, a cracked regime. Thucydides described this clearly by showing how external conflicts intensify internal factions until the city becomes its own worst battlefield. Gibbon shows that empires fall when external pressure meets a tired, fragmented center. Sun Tzu shows that defeat is born from poor self-knowledge, bad strategy, and failure to adapt. Thucydides shows that the fear spiral can make war feel unavoidable, and that war reshapes a society's inner morals until it corrodes political order itself. The final lesson is harsh. When external war becomes identity and habit, an empire starts paying with its own soul. And without cohesion, no territory, no arsenal, and no prestige can keep a world standing. A society doesn't have to be invaded to collapse. It can fall apart from the inside when it loses the ability to disagree without destroying itself. The name changes depending on the era: factions, polarization, civil war. But the mechanism is old. Groups start seeing each other as existential enemies, and the common good becomes an empty phrase. Once a society reaches that point, collective decisions become almost impossible, because every proposal is treated like a weapon from the other side. Politics stops being governance and becomes combat. Plato, in the Republic, describes the city as a moral organism. It gets sick when uncontrolled desires take over, and when the fight between factions replaces the search for what is just. For Plato, internal disorder begins when the rational part of the soul, the part that should guide choices, is defeated by appetite and ambition. That applies to individuals and to cities. A city ruled by desires becomes unstable. One moment it wants pleasure, the next it wants revenge, then riches, then security at any cost. In that environment, leaders learn to manipulate emotions, and people start confusing freedom with having no limits. Disorder becomes the norm because nobody accepts restraint. Each group tries to impose its desires as if they were justice itself. Plato also describes a dangerous sequence. Regimes decay when competition for power turns into competition for desire. Democracy, in Plato's view, can dissolve when freedom becomes permissiveness and moral authority loses respect. The result isn't a festival of freedom, but a fight to control the state. Public life fills up with speeches that promise everything and always blame the enemy. The city enters a state of constant excitement, and constant excitement wears down the political fabric. For Plato, that path prepares the ground for tyranny, because people exhausted by chaos begin to crave a savior who will impose order, even if the price is losing their freedom. Ibn Khaldun, in the Muqaddimah, explains internal crisis with a sharp sociological lens. The strength of a dynasty or state depends on asabiya, group cohesion. In the beginning, peoples with strong solidarity, often tied together by tribal bonds or shared discipline, conquer and organize. Over time, once the dynasty settles in, luxury, comfort and distance grow between elites and everyone else. Cohesion weakens, intrigue increases. Elites protect themselves more than they serve. To compensate for the loss of solidarity, the state expands control and spending, hires outside forces, and buys loyalty. That's the start of decline. When loyalty is no longer spontaneous, it has to be paid for. And once it has to be paid for, it becomes too expensive. Khaldun stresses that luxury isn't just moralizing about wealth. Luxury is corrosive because it changes habits. Discipline becomes indulgence. Courage becomes calculation. Responsibility becomes showmanship. The ruler surrounds himself with a court and flatterers. Offices turn into rewards. Truth becomes inconvenient. At the same time, rival groups sense weakness and fight for space inside the state. Politics becomes non-stop intrigue. The center loses energy and clarity, and when elites live as if they are separate from the people, asabiya breaks. There is no longer a we. There are palaces, and there are streets. Shunzi, in the Shunzi, gives an even more direct explanation for why this turns into conflict. He argues that human nature tends towards self-interest and disorder, unless it is trained and shaped by rituals, norms, and institutions. Without rituals, education, and institutional discipline, desires compete without limits, and society explodes into struggle. For Xunzi, order does not happen naturally. It has to be built. Rituals are not empty ceremony. They are practices that train self-control, respect, functional hierarchy, and a sense of place. Education isn't decoration. It shapes social character. And institutional discipline isn't only punishment. It's predictability. Clear rules that make cooperation possible. The connection between the three thinkers is strong. Plato shows a city ruled by desires and factions. Khaldun shows social cohesion dissolving under luxury and intrigue. Xunzi shows that without moral and institutional formation, desires turn into war. Internal collapse happens when a system loses its invisible brakes. Shame, honor, duty, trust, mutual respect. When those brakes weaken, only coercion is left. And coercion, as the sole foundation, creates resentment. Resentment fuels polarization. Polarization prepares civil war. Civil wars rarely start with, "Let's destroy our own house." They start with dehumanizing the other side. Language changes. The opponent becomes a traitor, a plague, an enemy of the people, an absolute threat. From there, anything feels justified. Institutions that should mediate conflict, courts, legislatures, the press, universities, start being seen as tools of one faction. Each group tries to capture the state because it believes that if it doesn't, it will be destroyed. That's the breaking point, when politics becomes a fight for survival, not a fight over policy. Plato would say, this is the moment the city loses its sense of justice and confuses force with truth. Khaldun would say a sabiyya has dissolved. There isn't enough solidarity to sustain shared sacrifice. Xunzi would say, education and ritual have failed. People no longer have inner habits that restrain impulses, and institutions can no longer discipline conflict without violence. Together, they explain why polarization isn't just strong opinions. It's a collapse of the basic mechanisms of living together. History shows how this can destroy societies even without a decisive outside enemy. The Roman Republic, in its final centuries, went through an escalation of factions, competition for prestige, buying support, political violence, and the militarization of public life. Civil war didn't come out of nowhere. It was prepared by decades of social tension and power struggle. In different eras and places, the pattern repeats. When the state becomes a prize for factions, internal peace becomes a fragile truce. And a fragile truce is an invitation to the next crisis. In the present, polarization gets new fuel. Social media speeds up outrage, rewards simplification, and punishes nuance. It doesn't create the problem from nothing, but it amplifies it. Belonging turns into tribal belonging. The other side becomes a caricature. Politics becomes total identity. Disagreeing isn't just thinking differently, it's being the enemy. That environment erodes trust because trust requires some basic assumption of good faith. Without good faith, there is no pact. And without a pact, real reform becomes almost impossible. The system freezes, and paralysis increases frustration, which increases radicalization. It becomes a self-poisoning cycle. If that cycle continues, the likely future is the normalization of low-intensity internal conflict, institutional sabotage, constant crises, localized political violence, systematic delegitimizing of elections and courts, and the rise of parallel authority. Modern civil war isn't always two uniform armies facing each other. It can look like social fragmentation, where regions, groups, and institutions stop recognizing the same center. Khaldun would recognize this as loss of cohesion and rising intrigue. Plato would recognize it as the victory of desires and factions. Xunzi would recognize it as a breakdown in education and ritual, the loss of the habits that make shared life possible. What prevents this kind of internal collapse is not everyone agreeing. Disagreement is normal. What prevents collapse is shared limits, respected rules of the game, minimum trust in fair procedures, and the ability to lose today and still exist tomorrow. When one side believes losing means social death, it won't accept losing. And when nobody accepts losing, politics becomes war. That is a practical definition of civil war. The impossibility of peaceful alternation without destruction. Plato emphasizes that a city needs inner order in its collective soul, the prudence to not be dragged around by passions. Calden emphasizes that a city needs real cohesion, bonds strong enough that groups will accept sacrifice for a shared destiny. Junzi emphasizes that a city needs formation and institutions, rituals, education, and discipline to restrain impulses and create predictability. Without those three pillars, internal crisis becomes almost inevitable, because human competition, unchecked and without breaks, tends to produce conflict. The final question this theme forces is uncomfortable and concrete. When you look at a polarized society, what's missing? Prudence, cohesion, or institutional discipline? If only one piece is missing, there's still room to correct course. If all three are missing, the system enters breakdown mode. And once that happens, collapse isn't some far-off event. It starts in language, moves into institutions, and ends in everyday life, where fear replaces trust and faction replaces citizenship. A civilization can look stable on the outside and still be breaking apart on the inside when its economy loses what makes any shared life possible. Trust in the currency, predictable prices, work that feels worthwhile, and a state that can fund the basics without becoming predatory. Economic crises aren't just bad numbers. They change how people behave. People stop investing, companies stop hiring, families stop planning, and the future turns into anxiety. When that happens at scale, society enters a kind of rational panic. Everyone tries to protect themselves, and that collective self-protection ends up damaging the system itself. Aristotle, in Politics, helps us see the original mistake. When the pursuit of wealth becomes an end in itself, the polis loses its shared purpose. For him, the city exists to make a good life possible, a life of virtue, participation, and stability. The economy should serve that purpose. The problem starts when money becomes the highest authority, when crematistics, the endless accumulation of wealth, especially through financial and speculative means, starts being treated as the ultimate value. In that reversal, the community stops being a we and turns into a marketplace of private interests. The citizen becomes a consumer, the ruler becomes a manager, and the common good becomes a slogan. Aristotle doesn't condemn trade by itself. He criticizes the obsession with the unlimited, because the unlimited has no inner break. When a society admires only those who accumulate, it begins to tolerate methods that rot the moral fabric: fraud, usury, manipulation, exploitation. The polis fragments because everyone tries to maximize personal gain, and public trust dissolves. The result is political. A city with no shared purpose becomes unstable, because it loses the reason to follow the same rules. When a crisis hits, the reaction isn't solidarity, it's a scramble to save your own side. Keynes, in the general theory, shows how that moral instability can turn into a material collapse. He describes crises as downward spirals fed by uncertainty and broken confidence. When business owners and families become pessimistic, they cut spending and investment. Lower spending and investment reduces income and jobs. Falling income and jobs confirms the pessimism, and the spiral keeps going. For Keynes, the economy isn't a self-correcting machine that always returns quickly to balance. It's a psychological and social system. Expectations and fear matter. A key idea in Keynes is that investment depends on animal spirits, a mix of confidence, courage, and a sense of the future. When that engine breaks, capital pulls back even when real needs and opportunities are everywhere. Society falls into a paradox. People want to work, and there are things that need to be done, but money stops moving and decisions freeze. The problem isn't a lack of ability, it's a lack of coordination and trust. In crises like that, even solid companies can fail because credit disappears, demand drops, and financial costs rise. Collapse becomes contagious. Currency becomes both a symbol and a tool of that trust. If people trust the currency, they're willing to work today to get paid tomorrow. They're willing to sell now and buy later. They're willing to save and plan. If trust in the currency collapses, society gets trapped in the short term. Prices become unstable, contracts stop meaning anything, and economic calculation turns into fear, and fear kills investment. History shows this in episodes of hyperinflation and currency breakdowns. It's not just prices went up. It's the destruction of social time. No one knows what tomorrow will be worth. Kautilya, in the Arthashastra, sees the state as the decisive piece for preventing that kind of disintegration. For him, without sound fiscal administration and the right incentives, the kingdom becomes poorer and loses the ability to govern and defend itself. Kautilya is practical. The government needs revenue, but if it collects revenue in a predatory way, it kills the economy that supports it. It needs to fight corruption, because corruption is money leaking out of the treasury and trust bleeding out of society. It needs to provide infrastructure, security, and predictability, because that raises production and lowers risk. A fiscally disorganized state can't pay the army, can't maintain public works, can't respond to emergencies. When the state loses capacity, the kingdom becomes easy prey, either for invaders or for internal factions. The Arthashastra also highlights something that still feels very current. Incentives shape behavior. If taxes punish production and reward speculation, production drops and speculation grows. If the law is unpredictable, the entrepreneur turns into a gambler. If the government changes the rules all the time, investment runs away. If corruption is rewarded, competence leaves. An economy doesn't collapse only because resources run out. It collapses when the incentive system pushes people toward choices that drain the shared wealth. Aristotle gives the moral diagnosis. A society that idolizes wealth loses its shared purpose. Keynes gives the dynamic diagnosis. Crises become spirals when confidence and investment collapse. Kautilya gives the administrative diagnosis. Without fiscal management and good incentives, the state loses capacity and the kingdom gets poorer. Together, they explain why economic collapse often comes before political collapse. Because the economy is the ground of everyday life. When the ground shifts, public trust shakes. A historical example of this connection is the financial turmoil near the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Empire, marked by deep inequality, heavy debt, land concentration, and political instability. When an economy favors a few and leaves large numbers of people without security, politics becomes explosive. Another example is the Great Depression in the 20th century. Mass unemployment, bankruptcies, and a collapse in investment fed radicalization and political crises in many countries. The pattern is usually similar. When the economy implodes, society goes searching for villains and saviors, and that opens space for both smart reforms and dangerous adventures. Today, economic risk shows up in some recognizable forms. One is chronic debt combined with the feeling of stagnation. People work hard but can't build stability, while housing, healthcare, and education costs keep squeezing them. Another is financialization. A large share of growth shows up in financial assets, while the real economy loses momentum for most people. That connects with Aristotle. Crematistics becomes a cultural ideal. The result isn't only inequality, it's instability, because inflated assets can crash, and when they crash, they drag credit, jobs, and confidence down with them. Another modern form is fragility in the monetary system and inflation expectations. Even without hyperinflation, high and persistent inflation wears down the social pact because it erodes wages, intensifies conflict over who gets what, and creates a sense of unfairness. Fiscal and monetary policy turns into a battlefield. If the state seems unable to control the currency and the budget, people start looking for protection outside the system. Informal dollarization, a rush into safe assets, capital flight, rising informality. That weakens tax revenue and state capacity even more, exactly the risk Kautilya would fear. The likely future in a world facing climate shocks, geopolitical tension, and technological disruption is repeated cycles of confidence crises. Extreme events can affect food and energy, driving prices up and pressuring governments. Conflicts can disrupt supply chains. New technologies can displace jobs and increase insecurity. In every cycle, the Keynesian question returns. Will investment recover, or will it freeze? And the Aristotelian question returns. Will society treat this as a shared problem, or will private wealth-seeking tear apart public life? And Kautilya's question returns. Will the state manage finances with prudence and fairness, or will it behave like a desperate collector, making the productive base even poorer? When crises become frequent, the temptation for fake solutions grows, printing hope like its currency, freezing prices without dealing with causes, blaming groups without reforming incentives, promising prosperity without rebuilding trust. These moves can bring short-term relief, but if they don't restore predictability and legitimacy, the spiral returns. Keynes would remind us that trust is the core. Without it, even well-meant policies fail, because nobody takes risks. Aristotle would remind us that purpose is the core. Without a common good, every adjustment turns into a brutal fight over who pays the bill. Kautilya would remind us that administration is the core. Without a capable government, crisis becomes permanent. In this view, the economy isn't separate from moral life. It's how a society organizes time, effort, and expectation. When currency loses meaning, life loses planning. When work loses reward, life loses dignity. When the state loses fiscal capacity, life loses protection. An economic collapse is, deep down, a collapse of trust in the future. And when the future stops feeling believable, people close in on the present, and a civilization, without a shared future, starts to unravel even if it still works on paper. A civilization can survive a bad ruler. What it usually can't survive is a system that depends on rulers' moods. When institutions fail and succession turns into chaotic conflict, the state loses continuity, predictability, and trust. Collective life becomes improvisation. And improvisation in politics is expensive. It creates repeated crises, opens the door for opportunists, and makes every transition a risk of rupture. At that point, collapse doesn't need an external enemy. It grows out of the vacuum created by the inability to transfer power in an orderly way. Montesquieu, in the spirit of the laws, offers a decisive principle. Institutions last when there is a balance of powers. Without it, decline speeds up. The core idea is simple. Power tends to be abused when it meets little resistance. If one center holds authority with no checks, decisions may be fast, but stability becomes hostage to personal character. If the ruler is cautious, the system seems to work. If not, the state becomes a tool of whim. A balance of powers, executive, legislative, judicial, along with stable laws and intermediate bodies, creates the opposite, an order that holds even when people change. That balance isn't weak government, it's survival architecture. It keeps political conflict from becoming all or nothing. If every election or leadership change means rewriting the rules and punishing opponents, politics becomes permanent war. Montesquieu understands that freedom and stability depend on institutional limits. Nobody can do everything. When those limits are eroded by personal rule, by captured institutions, by constant exceptions, the regime loses flexibility. And a regime without flexibility breaks easily, because any shock becomes a constitutional crisis. Plato, in Laws, agrees on the essentials, but goes even deeper. Stability depends on laws and civic education, not on the personality of rulers. In the Republic, Plato imagined an ideal government. In Laws, he faces the real world and admits that the best substitute for a wise ruler is a strong legal structure and a culture that trains citizens to respect it. Without that, the city swings between disorder and authoritarianism. When laws are weak, the ruler has to be strong. When the ruler is too strong, laws become decoration. For Plato, laws aren't only for punishment. They educate, they shape habits, They create predictability. A society that respects laws builds trust because people know what to expect. When the law changes based on the moment, to please one faction, reward allies, punish enemies, trust evaporates. Citizens stop seeing the law as protection and start seeing it as a weapon. And when the law becomes a weapon, succession becomes a battle. Whoever takes power tries to rewrite everything to protect themselves and to guarantee permanence. Confucius, in the Analects, highlights the human side of the problem. Succession and government require character and rituals. Without them, order becomes improvisation. For Confucius, politics isn't held together only by formal structures, but by virtue, example, and cultural continuity. Rituals, Li. Here aren't empty ceremonies. They are protocols and practices that create respect, functional hierarchy, a sense of duty, and a civilized way to manage conflict. A good succession for Confucius isn't just picking the next person. It's making sure the next person has training, character, and moral legitimacy so they can be obeyed without needing to humiliate or threaten. When succession ignores character and is based only on bloodline, favoritism, intrigue, or force, leadership quality drops and the state loses direction. Confucius is blunt. To govern is to correct names, to put each person in the right role, with responsibility and example. If the ruler is not a moral reference point, officials copy cynicism. If the elite doesn't practice duty, the people lose trust. If the transfer of power is messy, bureaucracy improvises, factions arm themselves, and government gets managed by crises instead of principles. Montesquieu explains why concentrating power speeds up decline. Plato explains why laws and civic education are the real foundation of stability. Confucius explains why character and rituals allow the machine to run without constant violence. Together, they show that institutional failures and bad succession are not technical details. They are the moment a society loses its sense of time. The civilization stops having continuity. Every government becomes a restart. Every restart becomes a fight. And constant fighting drains productive energy, destroys trust, and blocks long-term reform. There's a common historical pattern in regimes that enter this danger zone. First, institutions get bypassed through shortcuts, excessive decrees, exceptions, permanent emergencies. Then checks stop being respected, courts get captured, legislatures weakened, the press attacked or bought. Next, politics becomes personal. Everything depends on the leader. In that setting, succession becomes political terror, because the next person can punish the previous one. To avoid punishment, the leader tries to stay. To stay, they erode institutions even more. The system closes in on itself, and that closure raises the chance of a violent rupture when change finally comes. A classic example of how unstable succession destroys order is the collapse of dynasties in many historical periods, when internal fights over the throne produced wars, assassinations, and territorial fragmentation. Even without a decisive external invasion, the struggle for the center weakened the state and made it vulnerable. This is both technical and psychological. When the top is uncertain, every level below goes into defensive mode. Officials stockpile resources and alliances. Generals calculate loyalties. Local elites test autonomy. State unity becomes a constant negotiation. And a state in constant negotiation loses the ability to act. Today, institutional failure can appear in subtler and therefore more dangerous ways. One is the erosion of trust in the rules of the game. Elections challenged without evidence. Courts treated as just another faction. The constitution handled like an obstacle to get around. Another is a merit crisis inside the state. Jobs handed out for loyalty instead of competence. Another is polarization that turns the peaceful rotation of power into revenge. Each victory is used to dismantle the other side, and each defeat feels like an existential humiliation. That creates a built-in incentive for sabotage. The losing side won't cooperate because it believes cooperation only strengthens the enemy. If these trends deepen, the likely future is a higher risk of paralysis and authoritarian solutions. Paralysis happens when institutions can't decide. Gridlock, distrust, constant crisis. In tired societies, the desire for decisiveness and order grows, even if that means weakening checks and balances. Montesquieu would see this as the road to tyranny, destroying balance in exchange for speed. Plato would see it as the collapse of civic education, citizens agreeing to trade laws for strongmen. Confucius would see it as a failure of example. Leaders who can't inspire trust end up forcing obedience. A healthy succession depends on three things these thinkers emphasize, each in their own way. First, clear and stable rules for transferring power. Second, institutions with enough independence to prevent abuse and guarantee continuity. Third, a civic and moral culture that makes people respect the process even when they hate the outcome. When one of these is missing, succession becomes tense. When two are missing, succession becomes a crisis. When all three are missing, succession becomes a rupture. Institutional failure can also be measured by how well a state resists the temptation to improvise. Emergencies happen, but permanent emergencies are a sign of decay. A government that rules by exception all the time destroys normal life. And normal life is the foundation of trust. Plato would say laws exist to stop the city from being ruled by the desire of the moment. Montesquieu would say checks exist to stop a ruler's passion from becoming law. Confucius would say rituals exist to stop power from turning into brutality and arbitrariness. In the end, bad succession is a crisis of time. Society loses the ability to move through generations with stability. It gets trapped in the present, in the leader, in fear. And when politics runs on fear, it tends to exaggerate enemies and burn bridges. A healthy civilization can do something difficult, change leaders without panic. When that becomes impossible, collapse gets closer because the state becomes hostage to internal power struggles and everything else, economy, security, education, well-being, gets subordinated to the survival of the group in power. Montesquieu shows the structure that prevents this, balance of powers. Plato shows the foundation, laws and civic education. Confucius shows the human fuel, character and rituals that make succession an act of continuity, not war. When these three break, order becomes improvisation. And improvisation, repeated long enough, isn't flexibility, it's disintegration. When a society loses its shared why for existing together, it starts to function like a body without a heart. It still moves, still produces, still consumes, but it no longer knows where it's going. Laws can still stand, markets can still run, schools can still open their doors, and yet the dominant feeling becomes emptiness, cynicism, and disconnection. That's the ground of cultural collapse, not the immediate fall of buildings, but the slow fall of the meaning that stitches people into a we. Emile Durkheim, in Suicide, calls this anomie, the weakening of the shared norms that guide life. Norms aren't just legal rules, they're moral and social expectations that tell us what's acceptable, what's honorable, what's shameful, and what's worth pursuing. When those reference points fall apart, social cohesion dissolves. People are left without a map. And without a map, freedom feels heavy. Choices become anxiety. Comparison becomes torture. The individual feels alone in a world with no shared meaning. Durkheim shows that the issue isn't simply lack of religion or lack of tradition. The real problem is the lack of a stable symbolic structure that gives limits and direction. A society can change and still stay cohesive, as long as it offers new standards that people recognize as legitimate. Anomie appears when change is so fast, economic, technological, moral, that institutions can't create a new agreement. In that situation, the social bond weakens. People live side by side but don't recognize each other. The feeling grows that nobody is taking care of anyone and that everything is an individual struggle. This breakdown shows up in very concrete symptoms: more isolation, less trust, loss of faith in institutions, hostility between groups, and the feeling of not belonging. An anomic culture creates people who are expected to be totally responsible for their own fate and at the same time, powerless in front of the system. You're pressured to win, but you're not given a clear path. You're told to be yourself, but punished for not fitting invisible standards. That kind of contradiction wears down the collective mind. Society becomes a place where everyone seems to be running, and nobody knows exactly why. Oswald Spengler, in The Decline of the West, reads this emptiness on a historical scale. For him, civilizations age. The living, creative, spiritual phase of a culture turns into a late phase that is technical and mechanical, what he calls civilization. In that transition, culture loses its soul. What used to be art as a worldview becomes entertainment. What used to be politics as a shared destiny becomes management and propaganda. What used to be religion as meaning becomes a hollow morality or nostalgia. Creative energy gets replaced by repetition, bigness, and efficiency without purpose. Spengler isn't only talking about moral decline, he's talking about form. Late-stage society becomes urban, mass-oriented, obsessed with numbers and performance. The central symbol stops being the temple or the public square and becomes the machine, the market, the office, the system. People may have more comfort, but they feel less meaning. The collective spirit turns into exhaustion. The civilization still looks powerful, but it carries a kind of historical sadness. The sense that the grand story is over, and now all that's left is managing survival. This connects directly with Durkheim. Anomie can be seen as the personal, day-to-day experience of the cultural aging Spengler describes. When the world becomes a set of functions and goals, instead of a shared story, people lose what ties them to each other. Collective identity breaks into niches. Each group builds its own mini-story, its own morality, its own symbols, its own enemies. Society loses a common symbolic center. And when there's no center, any shock turns into tribal conflict. Zhuangzi offers a different and surprisingly modern lens on the same problem. In the Zhuangzi, there's a critique of rigid categories and fixed values that choke spontaneity and adaptation. When a society turns its concepts into prisons, this is right, that is wrong, as an unchangeable block. This kind of person matters, that kind is trash. As a permanent label, it loses flexibility. The world changes, but the words don't. And when the words don't change, thinking gets stuck. The group becomes unable to respond to something new without panic. Zhuangzi isn't defending empty relativism. He's showing that life is constant transformation, and values that are too rigid can break our ability to live together. When everything becomes an identity fight, every nuance feels like a threat. People start reading any difference as an attack. Life together loses lightness and turns into policing, and a society under constant moral policing lives under constant tension. Fear of messing up, fear of being cancelled, fear of not belonging. That emotional climate kills creativity and trust. Here's a central point for understanding cultural collapse. When shared meaning disappears, culture often tries to save itself with more rigidity. Instead of rebuilding a wide we, it narrows the we to protect a tribe. You get harsher codes, harder borders, more performative morality. It looks like order, but it's often a sign of symbolic desperation. Durkheim would say anomie produces this attempt to compensate. Spengler would say it's typical of a late civilization, lots of form, little soul. Zhuangzi would say that kind of rigidity suffocates the living path of adaptation. Today, this cultural collapse shows up as a strange mix, too much information and not enough meaning. There has never been so much talking and so little shared understanding. Never so many identities and so little cohesion. Public life becomes a war of narratives. Debate becomes a hunt for villains. Irony replaces commitment. The short term replaces any real project. When that becomes normal, society loses the ability to mobilize for hard goals, like facing economic crises, technological change, or environmental stress. Without shared meaning, any sacrifice feels unfair. And without collective sacrifice, a system can't make it through periods of pressure. If this keeps going, the most likely future is a culture of fragments, communities living in parallel symbolic universes, with different languages and incompatible moral worlds. In that situation, you don't even need open war. Simple inability to cooperate at a large scale is enough. Institutions freeze, reforms become impossible, and public space turns into a battlefield of resentment. The civilization still exists, but as groups sharing territory, not destiny. The alternative isn't going back to the past like time can be undone. The alternative is rebuilding shared reference points without crushing differences. Durkheim would point to the need for legitimate norms and real social bonds, not just bureaucratic rules. Spengler would remind us that a culture needs a soul, art, education, symbols, purpose, so it doesn't become a machine. Zhuangzi would remind us that living together requires flexibility, less obsession with fixed labels, more ability to listen and adapt. When shared meaning returns, society regains a quiet kind of strength. Trust. And trust doesn't come from slogans, it comes from practices. Practices of respect, civic education, cooperation, institutions that work, and a culture that offers meaning beyond consumption. Without that, a civilization can stay rich and high-tech and still drift toward an internal decline, where a lot works, but almost nothing inspires. Technological progress promises freedom, less effort, more comfort, more control over the world. But there's a quiet trap when technology stops being a tool and becomes a lens. When that happens, it's not only what we do that changes, it's how we see everything. People, nature, time, attention, and even emotions start being treated as resources to optimize. Society becomes more efficient and, at the same time, emptier. Civilization becomes more powerful and, at the same time, more fragile on the inside. Martin Heidegger, in The Question Concerning Technology, argues that the danger of technology isn't only in machines, but in the way it forces us to reveal and understand the world. Modern technology tends to frame reality as a standing reserve, something to be extracted, stored, measured, and used. It's the world seen as inventory. The forest becomes potential lumber, the river becomes energy, the soil becomes productivity. And in an even more delicate step, the human being becomes human capital, a metric, engagement, data. In that way, technology drains meaning because it replaces care with control and mystery with calculation. The result is a moral shift. When everything becomes a resource, everything becomes a means. And a society that turns everything into a means loses the ability to protect ends. Life stops being lived as an experience and starts being managed like a project. The question stops being, what is a good life? And becomes, what is most efficient? Heidegger warns that this kind of framing, Gestell, captures us because it feels normal. Technology offers solutions so quickly that our thinking gets used to not asking why we're living this way. Civilization starts confusing can do with should do. Lewis Mumford, in The Myth of the Machine, expands this to the level of society. He argues that there are mega-machines, huge social and technical systems that combine technology, bureaucracy, discipline, and organization to produce mass results. It's not just a physical machine, it's a social machine. In it, people become parts, tasks become procedures, and the system's goal starts becoming its own survival. The system demands conformity, standardization, speed, and obedience. The human being enters as a replaceable component. Mumford shows that the megamachine doesn't need to be openly totalitarian to dehumanize. It can operate inside modern societies that look free. All it takes is for work, education, consumption, and communication to be organized like psychological assembly lines: measure, compare, stimulate, punish, reward. Social life becomes programmable. Difference becomes noise. Slowness becomes inefficiency. Silence becomes lost productivity. 4. And when everything is tuned for performance, the emotional result is often exhaustion, anxiety, and the loss of inner autonomy. The connection between Heidegger and Mumford is direct. Heidegger describes technology as a way of seeing. Mumford describes technology as a way of organizing. A lens that turns everything into a resource fits perfectly with a system that turns everyone into parts. The loss of meaning becomes structural. Society gets used to asking, how much does it produce, before asking, what is it worth? And when that inversion becomes culture, civilization creates material progress with spiritual regression. The Buddhist tradition, especially the Dhammapada, targets the psychological core of this trap. Attachment and craving feed suffering and instability. The point isn't to be anti-technology, but to notice the inner mechanism that technology can amplify. The craving for novelty, control, validation, power, comparison. The more the mind is trained to chase quick stimulation and quick rewards, the more it suffers when it doesn't get them. And on a collective scale, a society addicted to novelty becomes a restless society. Unable to stay still, unable to listen, unable to hold long projects without distraction. Buddhism describes how craving creates a cycle: want, get, lose, want again. Satisfaction is brief, and anxiety returns. Modern technology can industrialize that cycle. There's always an update, a notification, a trend, a scandal, a promise of a better life in one more step. This isn't only entertainment, it's behavior design. The collective mind becomes more reactive and less reflective. And a reactive mind is easier to manipulate, easier to polarize, easier to steer into fear. Psychological instability becomes social instability. These three perspectives draw a clear sequence. First, technology teaches us to see the world as a resource, Heidegger. Then giant systems organize to extract and optimize that resource at scale, Mumford. Then individual cravings and attachments are intensified to keep the engine running, the Buddha. The result can be a civilization that is highly advanced and deeply dependent on energy, networks, algorithms, non-stop consumption, constant stimulation. As that dependency grows, resilience shrinks, society becomes less able to handle shocks, because it has lost simplicity, self-control, and meaning. In everyday life, this trap shows up in small signals. The difficulty of being in silence, the constant need to compare, turning human relationships into transactions, fear of falling behind, chronic fatigue. Politically, it shows up when decisions are driven by short-term metrics, instant popularity, and viral trends instead of long-term judgment. Economically, it shows up when innovation is used more to capture attention than to improve life. Culturally, it shows up when value becomes visibility, and visibility becomes power. This also helps explain why technology can speed up social crises. When the world is seen as a resource, people and groups can be treated as problems to manage. Care turns into control. Education turns into training. Politics turns into behavior engineering. Mumford would call that the mega machine. Society organizes itself to produce measurable results and sacrifices what doesn't fit on a chart: dignity, nuance, compassion. Heidegger would call it the loss of meaning. The world stops appearing as something to respect and starts appearing as something to use. Buddhism would call it amplified suffering, because total control is impossible and frustration turns into anger. If this logic continues without limits, the most likely future is a world with more automation and more surveillance, more predictive power and more human fragility. In societies like that, the temptation is to solve conflict through technical engineering: more data, more control, more filters, more algorithmic punishment. But that can deepen the problem because it treats symptoms while ignoring the cause: the loss of meaning and the compulsions of craving. The more society tries to control everything, the more dependent it becomes on systems that can fail, and the more it moves away from what creates real stability: trust, character, community, and self-control. The way out suggested by these views isn't to abandon technology, but to recover inner freedom and purpose. Heidegger points to the need to think differently, without reducing everything to inventory. Mumford points to the need to limit the mega machine and redirect systems toward human life, not automatic growth. The Dhammapada points to training the mind against attachment, reducing the hunger for novelty, cultivating presence, lowering comparison, and calming compulsion. A healthy civilization uses tools. It does not become a tool of its tools. When technology becomes destiny, progress turns into an elegant prison. When technology returns to being an instrument, it can serve a good life. The key test is simple. Is the system expanding care, autonomy, and meaning, or only expanding speed, control, and dependence? Over the long run, that difference separates resilient civilizations from civilizations that fall apart under the weight of their own shine. A regime starts losing its footing when its elites begin living in a world that's different from the world ordinary people live in. It's not just about income, it's a difference in reality, safety, time, health, mobility, access to information, and most of all, consequences. When the people making decisions don't pay the price for those decisions, politics becomes an experiment carried out on other people's lives. Distance turns into indifference. Indifference turns into contempt, and contempt, sooner or later, turns into rupture. Vilfredo Pareto, in The Mind and Society, describes political history as a cycle of elite circulation. Every society has elites, groups that control resources, knowledge, institutions, and power. A system stays stable when these elites can renew themselves, bring in talent, correct excesses, and respond to change. When the elite closes in on itself and blocks that circulation, it loses the ability to govern. It starts protecting privileges instead of managing the common good. Social energy that can't find an outlet through reform looks for an outlet through shock. For Pareto, when the elite becomes a club, the system breaks, either through gradual replacement, loss of influence, or sudden replacement, crisis, revolt, collapse. Pareto also distinguishes different types of elites. Some rule through force, others through consent, some through tradition, others through cunning, some through competence, others through propaganda. The problem shows up when the style that worked in the past no longer works, but the elite keeps using it anyway, because the world changed and they didn't change with it. In times of economic and technological transformation, this is common. New forms of work, new expectations, new urban groups, new cultural tension. If the elite responds with old formulas and self-protection, it loses legitimacy. And when legitimacy drops, the elite has to spend more energy to keep power, more marketing, more repression, more behind-the-scenes deals. That's a classic sign of a system getting stuck. Simone Weil, in The Need for Roots, describes the human impact of this kind of stagnation. When people lose their rootedness, resentment grows, and society becomes fragile. Rootedness, for her, is the real feeling of belonging to a community, a place, a history, work with dignity, and relationships that recognize human value. A society can be wealthy and still produce uprooted people. That happens when work is unstable, when community life breaks apart, when the city becomes constant displacement, when culture turns into pure consumption, and when the individual is treated like a disposable part. Will sees uprootedness as a kind of invisible violence. It doesn't need a weapon to hurt. It hurts through absence of meaning, recognition, and symbolic security. Uprooted people often look for aggressive substitutes for belonging: ideological tribes, fanaticism, leaders who promise identity and protection. Will sees this as a central political danger. Societies without roots are easy to manipulate, easy to polarize, and easy to break from the inside. Resentment grows because people feel they don't have a place, and that nobody at the top is paying attention. What links Weil to Pareto is that disconnected elites often produce uprootedness as an indirect result of their choices. When economic and political decisions prioritize abstract efficiency, metrics, and profits, but ignore human ties, communities get torn apart. Factories shut down, neighborhoods lose jobs, Public services decline, the cost of living near opportunity pushes people out, and life becomes constant relocation. The elite may call this adjustment, modernization, optimization. For the people living it, it's losing the ground under their feet, and losing that ground turns into anger. Mencius, in the Confucian tradition, turns this into a direct test of legitimacy. In Mencius, rulers lose the mandate of heaven when they ignore the people's well-being. This isn't poetry, it's political theory. The right to rule depends on taking care of the people. If the people are miserable, the ruler is illegitimate. If there is hunger, neglect, and avoidable suffering, that's proof the government has failed morally and administratively. Mencius doesn't separate ethics from stability. For him, governing means securing the conditions for a dignified life. Without that, the regime falls through revolt, replacement, or breakdown. The strength of this view is that it cuts through excuses. A ruler can have speeches, tradition, and symbols, but if they leave people without protection, they lose the mandate. And once they lose the mandate, they lose deep obedience. They might keep shallow obedience through coercion, but loyalty is already gone. That's the difference between controlling and governing. Governing requires recognition, controlling requires force, and force is expensive, wears down institutions, and speeds up collapse. These three thinkers describe a common sequence of decline when elites disconnect. First, the elite closes in: nepotism, self-protection, insulation from consequences. Second, ordinary people's lives lose stability: precarious work, insecurity, declining services, loss of belonging. Third, resentment and distrust grow. They don't live our life. Fourth, radical alternatives emerge. Anti-elite leaders break the system movements, intense polarization. Fifth, the system enters permanent instability, repeated crises, inability to build agreements, and rising risk of political violence. Pareto would call this a breakdown of circulation. Whale would call it the explosion of uprootedness. Mencius would call it the loss of the mandate. Historically, this shows up when elites become a separate class, somarchy. When economic crises hit the majority while the elite stays protected, the sense of injustice becomes moral. It's not just "I want more," it becomes "this is wrong." In societies like that, any scandal becomes proof that the system can't be reformed. And when a society believes the system can't be reformed, it starts accepting extreme solutions. That acceptance is what turns disconnection into a civilizational danger. Today, this disconnection shows up in recognizable form. One is geography: rich, protected centers versus outer areas with weak services and high violence. Another is time: those who have time to take care of their health, study, and rest versus those living in constant exhaustion. Another is risk: those with safety nets, assets, insurance, connections, versus those who fall and can't get back up. Another is language: elites speaking in technical, abstract terms, while ordinary people speak in concrete survival terms. When the languages don't meet, politics becomes impossible to communicate. And when politics becomes impossible to communicate, trust dies. If this distance keeps growing, the most likely future is cyclical instability. Stuck elites try to maintain control. Uprooted populations search for belonging and protection. Leaders promise to break the system. The system reacts by closing in even more. This cycle can lead to social and institutional fragmentation. Regions against regions, groups against groups, institutions losing credibility, and the growth of parallel solutions. In that kind of environment, the state loses the ability to act, because every decision is interpreted as either favoritism or attack. Pareto offers a cold warning: if the elite doesn't renew itself, it will be replaced, and not always smoothly. Simone Weil offers a human warning: without roots, society loses cohesion and becomes vulnerable to resentment and extremism. Mencius offers a moral and political warning: a ruler who ignores the people loses legitimacy and falls. The shared point is that power isn't held up only by force and money, it's held up by a bond. When that bond breaks, the system may still look stable for a while, but it's running on inertia. The key question here is simple. Do the people making decisions actually feel the cost of what they decide? If the answer is no, then disconnection is already in place. And when disconnection becomes normal, society loses something essential, the feeling of a shared destiny. Without a shared destiny, every crisis becomes an accusation, every sacrifice feels like an insult, and every government becomes a target. That's the shortest road to a rupture in the social pact. Shocks don't bring down civilizations by themselves. What brings civilizations down is how they respond to shocks. Drought, floods, epidemics, mass migration, crop failures, border wars, supply chain breakdowns, these things have happened many times in history. Some societies made it through and came out stronger. Others panicked, made the wrong calls, split apart from the inside, and collapsed. The deciding factor is governance under pressure, the ability to act quickly, fairly, and intelligently when normal no longer exists. Arnold Toynbee, in a study of history, sums it up with a simple idea. Civilizations grow and survive when they respond well to a challenge, and they collapse when they fail to respond. The challenge can be geographic, climatic, military, economic, or cultural. What matters isn't the size of the challenge, but the quality of the response. Toynbee argues that collapse often happens when elites stop being creative and start being imitative, repeating old solutions for new problems. The civilization gets stuck in its own past. The shock demands adaptation. Leadership offers ritual and propaganda. Reality wins. Toynbee also says that in times of crisis, societies need a creative minority that can propose real paths forward and earn public support. When that group loses its ability, or its credibility, it becomes a dominant minority. It rules through coercion and habit, not through inspiration or solutions. That's the stage where shocks turn deadly, because the people no longer trust and the elite no longer learns. The society becomes dangerously rigid. It tries to keep the old shape, even though the inside has changed. That produces delayed, badly tuned, and often unfair responses, the kind of response that turns an external problem into an internal break. John Locke, in the Second Treatise of Government, frames this in terms of legitimacy. Government exists to protect life, liberty, and property. Political power for Locke comes from consent. People accept authority because it offers protection and order. In a crisis, that contract is tested in a harsh way. If the government fails to protect, whether through incompetence, neglect, or abuse, it loses consent. Obedience becomes fragile. People start looking for protection on their own or through parallel groups, and political unity breaks apart. Locke matters here for a simple reason. A shock reveals what the state really is. In normal times, a lot of things hold together through habit. In a crisis, government has to prove its purpose. If it can't organize aid, keep people safe, stabilize supplies, communicate honestly, and enforce rules fairly, it loses the moral foundation of authority. And once authority loses that foundation, every state action becomes suspicious. Even necessary policies start to look like control, opportunism, or persecution. The crisis becomes a crisis of trust, and a crisis of trust multiplies the disaster. Kautilya, in the Arthashastra, offers the practical engineering to avoid this kind of failed response. For him, good governance means preparing ahead. Security, reserves, finances, alliances, intelligence, and efficient administration. A kingdom that waits for the crisis to arrive before acting is already behind. Kautilya treats the state like a prevention system. Build reserves, keep logistics working, protect routes, monitor threats, collect revenue without strangling production, and prepare plans for scarcity. Neglect, in this view, is fatal vulnerability, because shocks don't show up politely. The Arthashastra also emphasizes that the response must be fast and proportional. If the government is slow, people panic. If the government overreacts, it creates resentment. If the government protects some and sacrifices others, it destroys legitimacy. The right response isn't only technical, it's political. It has to feel fair, and it has to work. Kautilya understands that in a crisis, perception and execution move together. A brilliant plan that never reaches people is useless, and strong enforcement without fairness can ignite revolt. Put these three thinkers side by side, and you get a clear map of collapse caused by bad responses. Toynbee explains the civilizational level, failure in the challenge-response relationship. Locke explains the political contract level, loss of consent when the government doesn't protect. Kautilya explains the administrative level, lack of preparation and operational capacity. The fall begins when crisis hits and the state responds late, poorly, and with favoritism. The external shock becomes an internal breakdown of cohesion. Climate shocks show this clearly. A long drought isn't just less rain. It pressures food, energy, water, internal migration, rural jobs, and urban prices. If the state has reserves, irrigation systems, crop insurance, logistics, and safety nets, society can absorb it. If it doesn't, drought turns into inflation, localized hunger, unrest, and mass movement. And when people migrate, cities face conflict over housing, jobs, and security, plus resentment toward new arrivals. A natural shock turns into a social war. Toynbee would call that a failed response. Locke would say government lost its function. Kautilya would say there was no preparation. Disease shocks do the same thing in a different form. Epidemics test hospital capacity, public communication, coordination across institutions, and social trust. A bad response can create two disasters at once: high death rates and deep polarization. If messages are contradictory, if rules feel arbitrary, if elites seem protected while demanding sacrifice from everyone else, compliance breaks. People start acting from distrust. Distrust increases spread and chaos. The state then reaches for more control, and control without trust accelerates conflict. Locke would see this as broken consent, Toynbee as loss of creative leadership, Kautilya as failure of planning and administration. Mass migration, driven by war, climate, or economic collapse, is also a classic shock that becomes dangerous when handled poorly. Migration alone doesn't have to destroy a society. Societies have absorbed migration before. What destroys is institutional inability to integrate. Documentation, jobs, housing, healthcare, schools, and conflict mediation. If the state abandons that job, integration turns into a fight among poor people for scarce resources, and politics becomes a scapegoat machine. Fragmentation grows. Groups close in on themselves. The we shrinks. That's perfect ground for violence and radicalization. The most likely future is an era of more frequent overlapping shocks: extreme climate events, health outbreaks, geopolitical tensions, economic instability, and population displacement. The critical point won't be just having resources, but having the coordination capacity and legitimacy to mobilize them. The biggest risk is repeating bad responses until society loses trust for good. Because trust is finite. It takes a long time to build and is quick to lose. Every poorly managed crisis removes another brick from the social pact. After enough shocks, the whole building starts to shake. There are clear signs a civilization is failing the challenge-response test. One is constant improvisation, rules changing every week with no coherent explanation. Another is favoritism. Some groups are protected while others are sacrificed. Another is opacity. Authorities hide data, lie, or minimize the threat. Another is paralysis. Bureaucracies freeze and decisions arrive too late. Another is fragmentation. Local and central governments sabotage each other, and the public receives conflicting orders. In each sign, Locke would see consent eroding. Toynbee would see leadership in decline. Kautilya would see preventive governance failing. A good response to shocks doesn't require perfection. It requires three things: preparation, execution, and fairness people can recognize. Preparation is Kautilya. reserves, plans, alliances, logistics, intelligence. Execution is real institutional capacity, delivering results, not just announcements. Recognizable fairness is lock, protecting life and property in a way that people accept as legitimate. And adaptive creativity is Toynbee, learning from the shock and changing the system instead of pretending nothing changed. When these elements fail, a civilization enters its most dangerous mode, crisis on top of crisis, with a population increasingly unwilling to cooperate. At that point, the shock doesn't have to be huge to become fatal. It just has to be the next one. Because what collapses isn't only the economy or security. What collapses is the bond. And without that bond, no state survives a storm, no matter how many speeches it gives. A civilization starts to destroy itself when it loses the ability to learn. It's not a lack of individual intelligence, it's a collective failure to correct mistakes. Ideas become identity. Criticism becomes betrayal. Questions become threats. Society starts to prefer being right over staying alive. And when the world changes, because it always changes, that rigidity turns small mistakes into major disasters. That's what dogmatism is. A system that keeps getting things wrong without admitting it's wrong. And so it keeps getting things wrong until it breaks. Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, describes the difference between open and closed societies as a difference in how they deal with error. An open society accepts that human beings are fallible, so it builds institutions that allow constant correction, criticism, peaceful transfers of power, transparency, public debate, science, a free press, and limits on authority. A closed society, by contrast, organizes itself around a historical, religious, or ideological truth that cannot be questioned. In that kind of society, the question, "What if we're wrong?" is forbidden. The result is predictable. Bad decisions last far too long, because the priority becomes protecting the doctrine, not protecting people. Popper is especially critical of the urge to turn history into destiny. When a regime believes it knows the unavoidable laws of the future, it stops treating policies as testable ideas and starts treating them as a sacred mission. If something goes wrong, the plan is never blamed. Saboteurs are internal enemies, moral impurity, lack of faith, lack of unity. This is a classic dogmatic defense mechanism. It blocks learning by reframing conflicting evidence as proof of a conspiracy. Society closes its eyes and calls it loyalty. But reality doesn't negotiate with loyalty, it collects the bill. Popper's strength is his simple principle. The goal of government is not to find perfect leaders. It's to create systems that can remove bad leaders without bloodshed and correct bad directions without trauma. The greatest danger isn't making mistakes, it's having no way to fix them. In dogmatic societies, the cost of admitting error is so high, humiliation, punishment, loss of status, that nobody admits it. Lying becomes routine, reports get polished, debate disappears, and the civilization ends up driving while staring at the rearview mirror of its own pride. John Stuart Mill, in On Liberty, gives the psychological and moral argument for the same necessity. Without freedom of criticism, bad ideas aren't tested, and errors turn into disasters. Mill argues that even uncomfortable opinions have value because they force society to justify its beliefs and correct excesses. When an idea is protected from criticism, it rots. Even if it's true, it becomes a repeated dogma with no understanding behind it. And once it becomes dogma, it stops guiding action wisely. Instead of thinking, you get slogans. Mill also points out that silencing an opinion isn't just unfair to the speaker, it impoverishes the whole community because society loses a chance to discover a mistake or better understand a truth. For him, free speech is a correction tool. It allows weak arguments to be exposed and defeated before they become policy. When that tool is destroyed by state censorship, social fear, or moral persecution, the system loses its sensors. It stops noticing early warning signs. And when a system loses its senses, it only discovers it was wrong after the mistake has already become a crisis. Mill makes a key point for civilizations at risk. Public debate is not a cultural luxury, it's infrastructure. Just as bridges and roads keep goods moving, freedom of criticism keeps corrections moving. Without it, society runs on self-deception. And self-deception can work for a while, until the world delivers its verdict. Inflation, famine, environmental collapse, military defeat, social breakdown. Dogmatism is often comfortable before it becomes fatal. Nagarjuna, in the Mulamadhyamakakarika, brings an even deeper philosophical lens. Attachment to fixed truths creates confusion, while flexibility prevents collapse. His point is not, there is no truth, in a shallow sense. What Nagarjuna attacks is rigid attachment, clinging to views as if they were solid, permanent things. When the mind grips a fixed view about the self, the world, the enemy, the good, it starts distorting reality to fit that view. That produces personal suffering, and, on a social scale, it produces fanaticism. Nagarjuna's contribution to the collapse theme is showing that dogmatism is a kind of blindness created by attachment. Society becomes unable to see nuance, interdependence, and changing context. Categories become cages. Us and them become absolute. Right and wrong stop being careful judgments and become fixed identities. And when that happens, politics becomes purification. Eliminate the other side, silence dissent, crush contradiction. But eliminating contradiction also eliminates the chance to correct course. It's civilizational suicide dressed up as conviction. Popper calls this a closed society. Mill calls it the suppression of criticism. Nagarjuna calls it attachment to views. All three agree on one core point. Reality is complex, and a civilization survives only if it keeps the ability to adjust beliefs and policies as new evidence appears. Dogmatism is refusing to adjust. It's insisting the map matters more than the territory. But in the end, the territory always wins. In history, many collapses were preceded by elites who couldn't learn. They ignored warning signs, punished messengers, persecuted critics, and treated reform as a threat to order. The result is often ironic. To preserve the system, they block change. And by blocking change, they destroy the system. Popper would say gradual correction was forbidden, so correction arrived as rupture. Mill would say debate was suffocated, so error grew in the dark. Nagarjuna would say the collective mind clung to a fixed view and couldn't keep up with the world's impermanence. Today, dogmatism shows up in new outfits. It can be ideological, religious, nationalist, technocratic, or even scientific in the sense of turning a method into a creed. It shows up when groups choose information only to confirm what they already believe, when facts are accepted or rejected based on tribal convenience, when an honest question is treated as an attack, when complexity is reduced to catchy lines, when politics becomes permanent culture war. In that environment, learning is dangerous because changing your mind looks like weakness. And a society where changing your mind is weakness condemns itself to repeat mistakes. The most likely future, with climate shocks, technological disruption, and geopolitical stress, will demand fast learning. Rigid systems will suffer more because they respond late and they respond badly. The biggest threat won't be the crisis itself, it will be the inability to update decisions. When a society can't learn, it becomes predictable to its own problems. It always picks the same enemy, the same excuse, the same ritual. And rituals don't solve new crises. They only calm people for a moment. The antidote these thinkers point toward is not lazy relativism or chaos. It's disciplined openness. Popper argues for institutions that tolerate criticism and replace leaders without violence. Mill argues for free speech and debate, so ideas are tested before they harden into dogma. Nagarjuna argues for letting go of fixed views and learning to see relationships and change, without falling into extremes. In simple terms, a civilization needs intellectual humility, the courage to say, I might be wrong, And it needs mechanisms that turn that humility into real course correction. When a society keeps that ability, it makes mistakes and improves. When it loses it, it makes mistakes and doubles down. The first path builds resilience. The second path builds collapse. In the long run, the difference isn't who has more certainty, it's who can revise certainty without falling apart. A republic doesn't die only from military defeat or an economic crash. It dies when the shared character of its people rots to the point where no one feels responsible for the common good anymore. Collapse begins when duty starts to look naive, when public service becomes a business opportunity, when the law becomes something to work around, and when the question "what's right" gets replaced by "what benefits me?" In that situation, society may still look functional, but inside it has already lost the glue that lets different people live under the same rules. Cicero, in On the Republic and on Duties, puts civic virtue at the center of political survival. For him, a republic is a public thing, a shared agreement built on justice, participation, and responsibility. It requires citizens and leaders who can put duty above private interest when private interest threatens the community. Cicero sees decline as a shift in purpose. When the state stops being an instrument of the common good and becomes a tool for factions, families, and personal enrichment, the republic dissolves. It's not just a corruption problem, it's a meaning problem. The republic turns into a marketplace of offices and influence. For Cicero, duty isn't abstract moral preaching, it's survival discipline. A virtuous citizen isn't perfect, but understands there's a debt owed to the city, respect for the law, courage to defend institutions, and willingness to accept reasonable sacrifices. When that willingness disappears, the state loses its support, because no system can hold if everyone demands rights and nobody accepts obligations. A republic depends on a minority willing to serve without cynicism, and a majority that recognizes that service as valuable. When service becomes suspicious and being slick becomes admirable, the republic enters decline. Alistair MacIntyre, in After Virtue, explains how this moral decay can happen even without huge scandals. He argues that modern life has lost a shared tradition of virtues, and as a result, moral language breaks apart. People still use words like justice, freedom, dignity, and rights, but often without agreement about what those words really mean or what they're for. The result is a kind of morality in fragments. Each group has its own values, and those value systems don't connect. Society turns into a clash of strong preferences, not a shared search for the good. MacIntyre points to the risk of emotivism. When moral debates become mostly expressions of feeling, I like this, I hate that, this offends me, with no deeper shared story about virtue and human purpose. In that environment, persuasion gets harder, and what's left is pressure, cancellation, manipulation, and winning through cultural or institutional power. Politics becomes moral warfare with no common language. That destroys civic virtue, because virtue requires a shared horizon. If there's no basic agreement about what a good life is and what a just community looks like, the common good starts to feel fake, or like propaganda. MacIntyre also shows how modern institutions can quietly undermine virtue. Organizations start rewarding measurable short-term results instead of integrity and good judgment. Career replaces calling. Prestige replaces honor. People learn to perform values instead of living them. And when values become performance, social trust drops, because people can tell the difference between real character and convenient messaging. This erosion is slow but deep. It makes society lose the habit of believing in genuine commitment. Confucius, in the Analects, offers the most direct version of this. Order depends on virtue, ren, and practices, lie. Ren is humanity, kindness and moral character expressed through care and respect. Li is the set of rituals, norms and customs that train behavior and make life together predictable. For Confucius, stability doesn't come only from punishment or efficiency. It comes from moral example and the daily repetition of practices that build self-control, responsibility, and mutual respect. When Ren weakens, society hardens inside. When Li becomes a facade, the social fabric tears. The Confucian point is harsh and extremely practical. If leaders talk about virtue but don't live it, people learn hypocrisy. If the elite uses rituals as theatre to hide corruption, the public learns cynicism. And cynicism is civic poison because it kills the will to cooperate. A cynical society doesn't believe in sacrifice, it believes in advantage. So every sacrifice looks like manipulation. At that point, even good policies face resistance because nobody trusts the intent behind them. Order without trust becomes coercion, and coercion without virtue produces resentment. Cicero speaks of duty and the common good as the foundation of a republic. MacIntyre speaks of the loss of a shared tradition of virtues and the resulting moral fragmentation. Confucius speaks of character and lived practices as the support beam of social order. Together, they show how a civilization rots from the inside when it loses moral habits. It's not simply lack of religion or lack of ideology, it's the loss of virtue as something real, admirable, and lived. The decline of civic virtue shows up in recognizable signs. One is the worship of being clever. Breaking the rules gets praised as smart. Another is the normalization of everyone for themselves. Solidarity starts to look foolish. Another is the constant disrespect of public service. Every public worker is treated like a thief, every politician like an enemy, every institution like a scam. Another is debate turning into humiliation. Winning matters more than finding truth. Another is the loss of shame. Things that used to be condemned get defended with pride. When that spreads, a republic loses its moral center. Historically, republics fall into crisis when factions treat public life as private property. Cicero lived through the agony of the Roman Republic and saw it up close. Competition for power and wealth degraded institutions, increased political violence, and opened the door to authoritarian solutions. The Ciceronian lesson is that without virtue, laws aren't enough. They can exist on paper and still be used as weapons and shortcuts. The result is that citizens stop respecting the republic as a shared good and start treating it like a system to extract from. Today, the risk of collective decline is intensified by the speed of modern life. Communities have less space to build shared habits. Families and schools are under constant pressure. Public debate gets rewarded when it produces outrage. That encourages performative morality, signaling virtue instead of practicing it. MacIntyre would say this deepens fragmentation. Each group builds its own display case morality. Confucius would say the rituals have become a facade. Cicero would say duty has been replaced by private interest. If this continues, the likely future is an inability to sustain long-term republican institutions. Because republics require something rare, accepting limits even when you could abuse power, following rules even when you could win by breaking them, losing today and still belonging tomorrow. That depends on civic virtue. Without it, politics becomes a zero-sum game. Winners try to crush, losers try to sabotage. Stability becomes impossible, and society starts craving order imposed from above. Exactly the kind of outcome republics fear because it trades participation for obedience. For these authors, rebuilding civic virtue isn't nostalgia, it's survival. Cicero would say duty and the common good must be honored again, not mocked. MacIntyre would say virtues only become real when they live inside concrete practices and traditions, not just opinions. Confucius would say character is formed through repetition and example. Families, schools, leaders, and institutions have to live what they preach. Without that, civilization can keep the appearance of order, but it loses the substance. When virtue becomes decoration, collapse becomes a matter of time. Because crises always arrive: economic, climate-related, health-related, political. And the decisive question in every crisis is, can people still act like a community? If the answer is no, no constitution holds. No technology saves. No police force sustains it for long. What sustains a society is a collective character strong enough to recognize that something matters more than immediate advantage, a shared future. If you made it this far, you've already caught the hardest message. Civilizations don't fall only because of outside enemies. They rot when the we dies on the inside, when duty becomes a joke, when virtue turns into a mask, when the common good becomes something to trade. The collapse doesn't start with a loud explosion. It starts when we accept what should be unacceptable as normal. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these warning signs do you see the most in today's world? And which one do you think is the most dangerous for the future? Write it in the comments. I read them and reply, because this conversation isn't meant to stay as theory. It's meant to turn into awareness. If this video helped you see further, subscribe to the channel right now, because we don't do shallow content here. We use philosophy, history, and real life to understand the world for real. Hit the like button so this video reaches more people, and share it with someone who's into these topics. It helps the channel grow a lot. And don't leave yet. There are more videos on the channel that stay on this exact path, going deeper into each cause of collapse and how to spot these patterns before it's too late. Click the next video and keep going with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.